Hi everybody, my name is Christopher Yarber. Today we're going to talk about the domestic violence mandatory arrest policies, history, and effects. That's what my paper was on. Domestic violence is obviously an extremely persistent, highly damaging problem. It's something that's been around for a long time. It includes all forms of abuse, small to large, emotional to physical, everything in between. The damage may not really seem that apparent on the surface, but it has deep, lasting effects that can be generational. It's something that affects society as a whole. Interpersonal, domestic relationships are the building block of everything we've built today in society as a whole. So it's definitely has the potential to be extremely harmful. The history of public and private perception of this crime has gone through many stages, from outright willful ignorance and acceptance to outrage and sweeping legislation, which we've seen in the last couple decades. It's a crime that's certainly emotionally charged, even when it's not taking the levels of physical violence. For many years, some getting into the cause of this, even still today, largely, the male has been viewed as the caretaker and sometimes the disciplinarian of the household, especially historically speaking. At several points in history, both ancient and recently, the male was also given the authority to use physical violence to correct perceived disobedience and wrongdoing in the home. This included against the wife and children. This goes back as far as the Code of Hammurabi. We can see physical written evidence of this. It's also often thought that this is where the rule of thumb phrase comes from. That's been debunked a couple times, but there is some evidence that while it wasn't a codified law, that it was definitely used in practice. More severe penalties for domestic assault started popping up in places like California during the settlement of the West, those Wild West days. This took the form of increased fines, things like that. The enforcement definitely wasn't too broad, but it was more prevalent than it had been. Shortly after this, the temperance movement and the women's suffrage movements added to this, definitely really fueled that fire, till around 1920 is when it finally became illegal in every state. The enforcement varied wildly after that, but it was finally on the books illegal in every single state. Till the 70s, when the women's rights and the feminist movements really added more fuel to that fire. There was still a whole lot of turning a blind eye towards this, in the view that matters of the home are nothing that the state should be involved in. This eventually led to, in the late 70s, legal action in the form of class action lawsuits taken in places like California and New York, stating that the police had traditionally adopted a very low to absolutely no response policy to domestic assault, domestic violence, and that had resulted in countless murders and countless severe injuries. So this was argued that it was lacking in the arena of the 14th Amendment. There was no equal protection on the part of the women. This is what really drove many of the departments to build the framework that we see now for these domestic violence laws. They began to adopt the preferred arrest method, whereas if you can determine, or if certain thresholds were met during a domestic violence dispute, such as witnesses or injuries, things like that, then arrest was the preferred response. So this was really what drove the states to enact legislation that directed all departments to operate this way. It gave birth to what we classify now as the three main categories of warrantless arrest: is mandatory, preferred, and discretionary. Mandatory removes all discretion whatsoever. If you can determine that something has happened, then arrest will be made. Preferred, which is what we use in Tennessee, is you should take someone to jail if you can determine who the aggressor was, if there's evidence. And discretionary still leaves most of that up to the officer there on the street, but allows action without a warrant if those certain wickets are hit. It'd be easy to assume that once those were enacted back in the 70s and 80s that domestic violence would go down and arrests would go up. It's not quite that simple, though there is a large correlation. Sometimes it's argued that these laws take away the victim's preference And some people would think that, why would you want to continue being abused? What preference do you need other than the end of the violence? But this ignores a ton of details, a ton of nuance. There's always a fear of retribution. There's children to take into account. As a deputy sheriff, I can attest to many times where just the dynamic of the couple, the love between the two, comes into play. When you decide to take one to jail, the other changes their tune real quick and can become violent sometimes. It's a strange dynamic. The guilt of just sending somebody to jail is also prevalent. There are lots of factors we need to take into account. But from the time these laws really became active in the late 70s, we can go from 76 to 96. There were over 52,000 people killed by intimate partners, and that's both women and men. Over 31,000 women arrest men. In 76 alone, nearly 3,000 intimate partner homicides. That dropped to 2,570 in 86 and 1,809 in 96. That's nearly a 50% reduction. The arrest rate back in the 70s and 80s was between 7 and 15% for domestic violence, and now it's closer to 50%. So it doesn't take a whole lot of thinking to connect the dots there. Certainly not the entire cause, but the warrantless arrest policies are definitely a big driver there. The 1994 Violence Against Women Act, providing tons of funding and programming for domestic assault enforcement and treatment, that could also be attributed to it. There's still some pushback to these mandatory arrest practices, with the biggest being the victim's preference we talked about earlier. Retribution, again, seems to be the chief driver of these, but it's hard to, that may just be because it's the easiest to articulate. It's hard to put into words the other problems that may come up from a domestic violence arrest. Obviously, there's a ton of nuance there. Sometimes where there's an arrest for a small reason, it can cause more harm than it serves any good. There may be a small shoving match where both couples are guilty of technically assault, but there's no injury. There's other than some hurt pride and some raised voices, there's still an arrest made, and that may do more harm than good. The question of empowerment arises as well. We're looking at whether this law makes the victims feel like they've been served or feel like they've been given the power to end their abuse. But some people claim that it doesn't. Some people claim that it removes that power because you're taking away that choice. But overall, there's a positive view on the part of the victim. So with one study we looked at, 39 participants, all but one had at least one positive thing to say about mandatory arrest. But still, 75% of them say that they feared retribution. It's also worthy to point out that when asked, not a single one of these 39 described any feeling of empowerment. That may be a nuance that we don't understand or can't sufficiently articulate. One possible point of confusion between all of these viewpoints is the fact that we fight this problem with multiple agencies, multiple individuals coming from varied backgrounds, police, social workers, courts. All of these have the same goal of ending domestic violence, but they have very different ways in doing it. This may muddy the waters a bit when we're looking at how effective it is or where the reasoning's coming from or things like that. The bottom line, though, is that we've made great strides and we should continue to make great strides, and that mandatory arrest is only one of the many tools that we have to work on this problem, and then we should continue to make efforts to streamline those efforts between the agencies and between the personnel, and continue to take a deeper look at what works, what doesn't, why it works, and why it doesn't. I think that'll do it. I hope everybody has a great winter break.